Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Legends. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight we're traveling back more than 2,000 years to a city by the sea, a place where lamplight flickered across countless scrolls, where scholars walked through columned halls debating the nature of the stars, and where humanity once gathered all the knowledge it could find under a single roof. We're going to the lost Library of Alexandria. This is a story about books and the people who love them. It's about a grand vision to collect everything ever written, every idea ever recorded, and preserve it for all time. It's about geometry drawn in sand, measurements of the earth made with nothing but shadows and sticks, and the quiet hum of minds at work in reading halls that have long since turned to dust. But it's also a story about loss, not the dramatic kind, with roaring flames and villains, but the slower, quieter kind. The kind where knowledge fades line by line, scroll by scroll, as priorities shift and civilizations change. The kind of loss that happens when no one remembers to copy a text one more time, when a language dies, when a shelf sits empty and no one notices. Over the next couple of hours, we'll walk through the streets of ancient Alexandria at twilight. We'll meet the scholars who lived and worked in the library's halls. We'll explore what kinds of knowledge they gathered: mathematics and medicine, poetry and philosophy, maps of the world, and theories about the cosmos. We'll consider what might have been lost when the library disappeared, and what echoes of it remain in our world today. This isn't a mystery we'll solve, because historians still debate exactly what happened. Instead, this is an invitation to wonder, to imagine those quiet halls, to think about what it means to preserve knowledge and what it means to let it go. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, these slow journeys through history and legend, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And if a particular moment resonates with you, or if there's another legendary place or story you'd like to hear about, leave a comment below. I read them all, and your suggestions help shape future episodes. Now then, let's dim the lights and begin our journey. Close your eyes if you'd like, or simply settle in. We're going to Alexandria, to a time when the harbor was full of ships, the library's shelves were full of scrolls, and the future of human knowledge seemed boundless. Let's start at the beginning, with the city of quiet light. Picture Alexandria on a warm Mediterranean evening, just as the sun disappears beyond the horizon and the first stars begin to appear. The harbor is never truly silent. Even at this hour, ships arrive from distant ports, from Athens and Rhodes, from Tyre and Carthage, from ports along the African coast, whose names have been forgotten. Their sails catch the last golden light as they glide past the Pharos, that great lighthouse rising up from the rocky island at the harbor's mouth. Its fire burns through the night, a beacon visible for miles across the dark water, guiding travelers home. On the docks, sailors secure their vessels with thick ropes. Cargo is unloaded: amphorae of wine and oil, bundles of fabric, crates of spices. But also, wooden chests containing something more precious: scrolls, books, manuscripts wrapped carefully in linen to protect them from salt spray and moisture. Knowledge traveling across the sea. In the streets beyond the harbor, oil lamps are being lit. Their warm glow spills from windows and doorways, casting soft shadows on limestone walls. The city settles into its evening rhythm, merchants closing their stalls, families gathering for meals, the heat of the day finally releasing its grip. And somewhere in this city, in buildings whose exact location historians still debate, scrolls rest on wooden shelves, thousands upon thousands of them. Papyrus rolls containing the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, mathematics from Babylon, poetry from Athens, medical texts from the Egyptian temples, astronomical observations from Persia, philosophy, history, drama, geography, all gathered here in this one extraordinary place. This is Alexandria in its golden age, a city built on intention, on the radical idea that knowledge from every corner of the known world could be brought together, preserved, studied, and expanded. A city where scholars could devote their entire lives to understanding the universe, supported by royal patronage, freed from the need to grow their own food or build their own shelter. In the reading halls of the library, lamplight flickers across unrolled manuscripts. A scholar traces a finger along a line of text, lips moving silently. Another copies a passage onto fresh papyrus, dipping a reed pen into ink, forming each letter with care. Two philosophers debate quietly in a corner, their voices soft, not wanting to disturb the others. This is not a place of urgency. There are no deadlines here, no rush to publish or promote. Knowledge accumulates slowly, like sediment building up on the sea floor. One insight leads to another, which leads to a question, which leads to decades of observation and thought. And yet, even in this moment of abundance, even in this golden age, the seeds of loss are already present. Because nothing lasts forever. Cities rise and fall. Priorities change. Fires break out. Budgets are cut. Wars come. Languages evolve and texts become unreadable. Papyrus decays in damp air. The great tragedy of the Library of Alexandria is not that it was destroyed in a single catastrophic moment, though many believe it was. The real story is quieter, slower, more human. It's a story about how knowledge fades when we stop paying attention to it. How the library dies not with a bang, but with the soft sound of a scroll crumbling to dust, unnoticed on a forgotten shelf. Tonight, we're going to explore that story. We're going to ask, what was the Library of Alexandria really? Not the legend, but the reality. Who built it and why? What did it contain? Who worked there? And most importantly, what might humanity have lost when it disappeared? Let's begin by going back further still, before the library existed at all. Back to the moment when Alexandria itself was just an idea, a dream in the mind of a young conqueror who believed he could reshape the world. The year is 331 BCE. Alexander the Great, not yet 30 years old, stands on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis. Behind him stretches the Nile Delta, that ancient fertile land where Egyptian civilization has flourished for 3,000 years. Before him, the open sea. He has just conquered Egypt, welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. The Egyptian priests have declared him Pharaoh, son of the god Ammonius. But Alexander is not content to simply rule what exists. He wants to build something new. He gestures to the land around him, describing his vision to the architects and engineers who travel with his army. Here, he says, we will build a city. Not an Egyptian city and not a Greek city, but something that belongs to both worlds and to all the worlds beyond. A city of straight streets laid out in a perfect grid, of marble columns and wide harbors, of temples and theaters and markets where merchants from every corner of the known world can meet and trade. According to legend, Alexander himself marked out the city's boundaries using barley flour when no chalk could be found. Birds descended and ate the grain, which the seers interpreted as a sign that the city would feed multitudes from across the world. Within a few months, Alexander was gone again, chasing his empire eastward toward Persia, India, and ultimately his death in Babylon at the age of 32. He would never see the city that bore his name, but the vision persisted. After Alexander's death, his vast empire fractured. His generals, the Diadochi, carved up his conquests and went to war with one another for decades. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted companions, a Macedonian general who had fought beside him since childhood. Ptolemy was shrewd. He understood that military might alone wouldn't hold a kingdom together. He needed legitimacy. He needed culture. He needed to make Egypt, and specifically his new capital of Alexandria, a center not just of power, but of civilization itself. Egypt had always been a crossroads. For thousands of years, it had stood at the meeting point of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean world. Trade routes converged here. The Nile connected the interior of Africa to the sea. Caravans arrived from the east carrying silk and spices. Ships came from Greece and Phoenicia and beyond. But Egypt was also culturally complex in ways that fascinated the Greeks. The Egyptians had their own ancient traditions of learning, temples that served as repositories of knowledge, pre-scholars who studied medicine and astronomy, hieroglyphic texts that recorded thousands of years of history and religious practice. The Greeks, meanwhile, were in the midst of their own intellectual flowering. In Athens, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle had established schools of thought that would echo through the centuries. Greek mathematicians were exploring geometry. Greek playwrights were creating tragedies and comedies that examined the human condition. Greek historians were recording the deeds of their people for posterity. Alexandria, by design, was meant to be the place where all these traditions met and mingled. Greek and Egyptian, African and Asian, the known world condensed into one planned city of order and ambition. Ptolemy made Alexandria his capital and began building it in earnest. The city grew rapidly. Wide streets intersected at right angles. The harbor was expanded and improved. Markets flourished. Temples rose, both Greek and Egyptian ones, sometimes combining elements of both traditions in ways that would have seemed strange just a generation earlier. There was a hunger in this new Hellenistic world, this Greek-influenced Mediterranean culture that Alexander's conquests had created. A hunger not just for land or wealth, but for knowledge, for understanding, for collecting and preserving the wisdom of the ages. In Athens, Aristotle had taught that knowledge came from observation and reasoning, that the universe operated according to principles that could be discovered and understood. His student, Alexander, had carried that Greek intellectual curiosity with him to the ends of the earth, collecting specimens and observations, sending information back to his former teacher. Now Ptolemy, who had witnessed Alexander's thirst for knowledge firsthand, wanted to create something even more ambitious. Not just a school, but a universal repository. A place where scholars could study everything: mathematics and medicine, astronomy and poetry, geography and philosophy. He wanted to build something that had never existed before. A library that contained all the knowledge of the known world. And so, in the early years of the 3rd century BCE, perhaps around 295 or 290, construction began on the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses, and its extraordinary library. It would be built somewhere near the royal palaces, in the heart of Alexandria's magnificent waterfront district. The dream was audacious. The ambition was staggering. And for a few brilliant centuries, they actually came close to achieving it. Ptolemy I Soter, Ptolemy the Savior, as he styled himself, understood something fundamental about power. Military strength could conquer territory, but culture could conquer minds. Legitimacy came not just from the sword, but from being seen as a patron of civilization itself. He had stolen Alexander's body, intercepting the funeral procession and bringing it to Egypt, where it would eventually rest in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria. This was a symbolic claim. Egypt was the true heir to Alexander's vision, and Alexandria was its capital. But Ptolemy wanted more than symbols. He wanted substance. He wanted his dynasty to be remembered not just as pharaohs or kings, but as the guardians of human knowledge. And so he established the Mouseion, literally a house of the Muses, those 9 Greek goddesses who inspired poetry, music, history, astronomy, and all the arts and sciences. It was a temple, yes, but also something more, a research institution, a university before universities existed, a place where the greatest minds of the age could gather to think, debate, study, and push the boundaries of human understanding. At the heart of the Mouseion was the library, and the library was built on a vision that was, for its time, almost incomprehensibly radical. Imagine the ambition of it. In the ancient world, books were rare and precious. Each one had to be copied by hand, letter by letter, scroll by scroll. A single text might take weeks or months to reproduce. Libraries existed, certainly. Temple libraries, palace libraries, the private collections of wealthy scholars. But they were small, local, specialized. What Ptolemy proposed was different. He wanted to collect everything, every text, from every culture, in every language. Every play ever performed in Athens, every mathematical treatise from Babylon, every medical text from Egypt, every philosophical dialogue, every history, every poem, every astronomical observation, every geographical account. The goal was nothing less than universal knowledge, the entirety of human wisdom gathered in one place. To lead this extraordinary project, Ptolemy appointed Demetrius of Phalerum, an Athenian philosopher and statesman who had once governed Athens itself. Demetrius brought with him the intellectual traditions of Aristotle's Lyceum, including the practice of systematic collection and organization of knowledge. Under Demetrius and his successors, the library became more than just a storage space. It became an active center of scholarship. Books weren't just collected, they were studied, compared, corrected, debated, and expanded upon. The early librarians understood something crucial. Knowledge isn't static. A text sitting unread on a shelf isn't knowledge at all. It's just ink on papyrus. Knowledge comes alive only when minds engage with it, question it, build upon it. And so, the library was designed as a living institution. Scholars lived on site, supported by royal stipends. They were given everything they needed: food, housing, exemption from taxes, so they could devote themselves entirely to their studies. They formed a community of inquiry, eating together, walking in the gardens together, attending lectures and debates together. The Ptolemies continued this patronage generation after generation. Ptolemy II Philadelphus expanded the collection aggressively. His son, Ptolemy III Euergetes, was said to be so obsessed with acquiring texts that he ordered every ship entering Alexandria's harbor to be searched. Any books found on board were confiscated, taken to the library, copied, and sometimes only the copies were returned to their owners. The originals remained in Alexandria. There's a famous story, probably exaggerated but revealing nonetheless, about Ptolemy III and the official texts of the great Athenian tragedies, the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These precious originals were kept in Athens' state archive. Ptolemy asked to borrow them, offering an enormous deposit of 15 talents of silver as security, a fortune meant to guarantee their safe return. Athens agreed. The texts arrived in Alexandria. Ptolemy had them copied with meticulous care onto the finest papyrus. And then he made his decision. He would keep the originals and send back the copies. He forfeited the 15 talents without hesitation. The original texts of the great tragedies were worth more than silver. Whether this story is true or not, it captures something essential about how the Ptolemies viewed books. They were sacred objects. They contained the voices of the dead, the wisdom of the ages, insights that could never be recovered if lost. The library developed classification systems to organize its vast holdings. Callimachus, one of the great scholar poets of Alexandria, created what was essentially the world's first library catalog, the Pinox, or tablets. This enormous work, running to 120 volumes, listed and classified the library's contents by subject and author. Texts were organized into categories: poetry, drama, history, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, law, and more. Within each category, works were further subdivided. Authors were listed with biographical information. Different editions and versions of texts were noted and compared. This was revolutionary. It meant that knowledge could be found, referenced, built upon. It meant that a scholar in Alexandria could discover what a philosopher in Athens had written a century earlier, or what a mathematician in Babylon had calculated generations ago. The library wasn't just preserving the past. It was creating the conditions for new knowledge to emerge. When you could access everything that had been thought before, you could see patterns, make connections, ask new questions. This was the vision, a place where human knowledge didn't just survive, but grew, where the wisdom of the past became the foundation for the discoveries of the future, where scholars from different cultures and traditions could meet and learn from one another. For a few remarkable centuries, that vision became reality. Close your eyes and imagine walking through the Library of Alexandria on an ordinary afternoon in the 3rd century BC. The exact layout of the building or buildings is something historians still debate. No architectural plans survive. No definite ruins have been found. We have only fragments of descriptions from ancient writers, pieced together like a puzzle with most of its pieces missing. But from these fragments, we can sketch a picture. You enter through a colonnaded portico, stepping from the bright Mediterranean sunlight into cool shade. Columns rise around you, likely in the Greek style, fluted marble or limestone, topped with Corinthian capitals carved with acanthus leaves. The air smells of papyrus, lamp oil, and the faint mustiness of old documents. The main reading halls are spacious and airy, designed to catch natural light during the day. Tall windows allow sunlight to stream in, illuminating the rows of shelves that line the walls. These shelves hold wooden boxes and cylindrical containers, each one containing scrolls, carefully rolled and labeled. Some scrolls are new, their papyrus still pale and flexible. Others are older, their edges darkened with age and handling, the papyrus becoming brittle. Each scroll has a small tag attached to its wooden rod, a syllabus, identifying its contents, the author's name, the title of the work, sometimes notes about which edition or version this is. In the center of the hall, long tables provide space for reading and copying. Scholars sit on benches, scrolls unrolled before them. Reading a scroll is different from reading a modern book. You can't flip back and forth easily. You unroll it from right to left as you read, the text appearing in columns, rolling up the portion you've already read while revealing what comes next. It requires focus, patience. There are no paragraph breaks, no punctuation as we understand it, often no spaces between words. Reading is an active, interpretive process. At one table, a scholar hunches over a text, his lips moving silently as he works through a mathematical proof. His fingers are stained with ink. Beside him are his own notes on papyrus, covered with diagrams and calculations. At another table, a younger scholar copies a text, his hand moving steadily across fresh papyrus. He dips his reed pen into a pot of ink, carbon black mixed with gum, the standard writing medium. Each letter must be formed carefully. One mistake could corrupt the text for future generations. The work is tedious but essential. This is how knowledge survives, one copy at a time. Beyond the main hall, there are smaller rooms for specialized collections. Medical texts in one area, astronomical observations in another, the great works of Greek drama and poetry in a section of honor. There are lecture halls where visiting scholars present their ideas, where debates unfold over the nature of the cosmos, the best form of government, the proper interpretation of Homer. These debates can be vigorous, even heated, but they're governed by rules of discourse inherited from Greek tradition. Reason, argument, evidence, the willingness to follow logic wherever it leads. Outside, there are gardens. Trees provide shade, date palms, perhaps, or sycamores. Paths wind between planted beds. Scholars walk here in pairs or small groups, continuing their discussions in the open air. Some sit on stone benches, reading in the dappled light. Others stand by a fountain, gesturing as they make a point, their voices carrying softly across the garden. This outdoor space is part of the institution's design. The Greeks believed that learning happened not just through solitary study, but through dialogue, through the exchange of ideas. Aristotle had taught while walking with his students in the Lyceum's gardens. Here in Alexandria, that tradition continued. The scholars who live and work here come from across the Hellenistic world. Some are Egyptian, versed in the ancient traditions of their homeland. Others are Greek, trained in the philosophical schools of Athens or Rhodes. There are scholars from Syria, from Persia, from distant lands whose names barely register in Mediterranean geography. They are supported by the state, given rooms to live in, meals to eat, freed from the need to earn their living through teaching or other work. This is an extraordinary privilege, and they know it. Nowhere else in the ancient world is there such an arrangement. To be appointed to the Mouseion is to join an elite community of inquiry, to be given the gift of time to think. The days follow a rhythm. Mornings are often spent in private study or copying. The light is best then, clear and bright. Afternoons might bring lectures or debates. Evenings are for conversation, for the informal exchange of ideas over simple meals, bread, cheese, olives, wine mixed with water in the Greek fashion. As night falls, oil lamps are lit, small clay vessels filled with olive oil, with wicks of twisted flax. The light they provide is gentle, flickering, casting moving shadows on the walls. Scholars continue their work by lamplight, though it strains the eyes. The important work of copying is usually saved for daylight. Late at night, the library grows quiet. Most scholars have retired to their rooms, but here and there a lamp still burns. Someone is still reading, still thinking, unwilling to set aside a problem that has captured their imagination. Outside, the city of Alexandria continues its own rhythms. Ships rock gently in the harbor. The Pharos lighthouse sends its beacon across the dark water. Market vendors prepare for the next day. Families sleep in their homes. And in the library, knowledge rests on its shelves, waiting for the scholars who will return in the morning, waiting for future generations who will seek answers to questions not yet asked, waiting, though no one knows it yet, for the slow erosion of time and circumstance that will eventually scatter it all to the winds. But that's ahead. For now, in this moment, the library is alive. It hums with quiet purpose. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do: preserve the past, illuminate the present, and make possible the future. The library's collection didn't simply appear. It was built scroll by scroll through a combination of ambition, strategy, and sometimes practices that existed in the gray areas between borrowing and appropriation. We've already heard the story of ships being searched when they entered Alexandria's harbor. Let's imagine that scene more fully. A merchant vessel from Rhodes drops anchor in the great harbor. The captain and crew have made this journey many times. They know the routine. Harbor officials board the ship to inspect the cargo, to collect customs duties, to ensure everything is in order. But these officials have an additional duty unique to Alexandria. They ask, "Are there any books on board?" Perhaps the captain has a small collection in his cabin. A few scrolls he reads during long voyages. Or maybe one of the passengers is a scholar traveling with precious texts from his home city. Or perhaps the cargo itself includes books being shipped as trade goods. Whatever books are found are taken ashore. The owners are given receipts. The scrolls are brought to the library, where professional scribes set to work copying them. The work is done carefully on good quality papyrus. When the copies are complete, the ship's owners are supposed to receive their books back. But as we've heard, sometimes they received the copies while the originals remained in Alexandria, labeled as from the ships. The Ptolemies wanted the earliest, most authentic versions of texts, and they were willing to bend ethical rules to get them. This wasn't the only method of acquisition, of course. The Ptolemies sent agents throughout the Mediterranean world with instructions to purchase books. They offered generous prices. They commissioned copies of important works. They requested loans from other cities and institutions, sometimes with genuine intention to return them, sometimes not. Royal correspondence included formal requests for books. Letters would be sent to rulers in Athens, in Rhodes, in Pergamum, in cities across the Greek-speaking world. The message was clear. Alexandria valued knowledge above almost everything else and would reward those who helped expand its collection. Individual scholars who came to work at the library often brought their own collections with them, which would be absorbed into the larger whole. When a scholar died, his personal library might be purchased from his heirs or donated to the institution. Gift-giving played a role too. Foreign dignitaries visiting Alexandria might present rare texts as diplomatic offerings. Knowing this was the kind of gift the Ptolemies valued most highly. The result was a collection that represented an extraordinary range of languages and cultures. Greek texts formed the core. Certainly, this was, after all, a Greek institution built by a Greek dynasty. The great works of Greek literature were there. Homer's epics, the plays of the Athenian dramatists, the philosophical dialogues of Plato, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides. But the library's ambitions extended far beyond Greek. Egyptian texts were collected, both in hieroglyphics and in the more common Demotic script. The ancient wisdom of Egypt's temples, medical knowledge accumulated over millennia, astronomical observations, mathematical techniques, religious texts, found a place on the library's shelves. Hebrew texts were translated into Greek. Most famously the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which according to legend was completed by 72 scholars in 72 days. Whether the legend is true or not, the translation certainly existed, and it represented a monumental effort to make one culture's sacred text accessible to another. Babylonian astronomical records were acquired, containing observations of the heavens that stretched back centuries. The Babylonians had tracked planetary movements with remarkable precision, had predicted eclipses, had developed mathematical techniques for celestial calculation. This knowledge was precious. Persian texts arrived, bringing with them different philosophical traditions, different ways of organizing knowledge about medicine and natural history. There were even texts from India, though exactly what these contained and how many there were is now impossible to know. Sanskrit was a distant language to the Greeks, and translation would have been extraordinarily difficult. But the ambition was there. to reach even beyond the borders of what the Greeks considered civilization. This multilingual collection raised an enormous challenge: translation. How do you preserve knowledge that's written in a language your scholars can't read? The library employed translators, bilingual scholars who could move between languages, rendering Egyptian into Greek, Babylonian into Greek, Hebrew into Greek. Greek became the lingua franca of the library, the common language that allowed scholars from different backgrounds to access the collected knowledge. But translation is never perfect. Every translator makes choices about how to render concepts that might not exist in the target language, how to convey nuance and context, which words to use when several options exist. And so, even as the library preserved knowledge, it also inevitably transformed it. The Egyptian medical text becomes a Greek medical text. Not quite the same thing. The Babylonian astronomical treatise, translated and annotated, takes on new meanings, new interpretations. This was both the library's great strength and its limitation. It made knowledge accessible across cultures, but in doing so, it filtered everything through a Greek lens. Still, the effort was remarkable. Nowhere else in the ancient world was there such a systematic attempt to collect and preserve knowledge from so many different sources. The library didn't just want Greek knowledge, it wanted human knowledge from as many traditions as it could reach. And with each new text that arrived, whether purchased or copied or borrowed or seized, the collection grew. The shelves filled. The catalogs expanded. The dream of universal knowledge seemed, for a time, almost within reach. A library is not truly alive until minds engage with what it contains. The scrolls on the shelves are potential. It's the scholars who transform that potential into understanding, into new ideas, into knowledge that ripples out beyond the library's walls. Let's meet some of the people who walked those halls, who unrolled those scrolls by lamplight, who asked questions that no one had thought to ask before. Euclid arrived in Alexandria sometime around 300 BCE, during the reign of the first Ptolemy. He was a mathematician, and he brought with him a project that would change how humans thought about geometry forever. In the library's quiet halls, Euclid gathered everything that was known about geometry, the properties of lines and angles, of triangles and circles, of solid shapes. He studied the work of earlier mathematicians, the Greek geometers who had come before him. And then he did something extraordinary. He organized it all into a single, logical system. His work, The Elements, started with a handful of simple definitions and assumptions, axioms that seemed self-evidently true. From these, using pure logic, he built up an entire architecture of knowledge. One proposition led to the next, each proof resting on what came before, a chain of reasoning that was unbreakable if you accepted the starting points. The Elements wasn't just a book about geometry. It was a demonstration of how knowledge could be organized, how logic could be used to build certainty out of basic principles. For more than 2,000 years, it would remain the foundational textbook of mathematics, second only to the Bible in number of editions published. Euclid worked patiently, methodically. There are stories about him, probably apocryphal, but revealing. One tale claims that Ptolemy, I once asked if there was an easier way to learn geometry than working through the elements. Euclid supposedly replied that there is no royal road to geometry. king or commoner, everyone must follow the same path of understanding. Then there was Eratosthenes, who became the chief librarian around 245 BCE. He was nicknamed Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, because he was supposedly second best at everything. A good mathematician, but not the best. A good geographer, but not the best. A good poet, but not the best. But Eratosthenes achieved something remarkable. He measured the circumference of the earth, and he did it with stunning accuracy, using nothing but shadows and geometry. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun shone directly down a well in Syene, far to the south, modern-day Aswan. No shadow was cast. The sun was directly overhead. But in Alexandria on the same day at the same time, vertical objects cast shadows. The sun was not directly overhead. Eratosthenes measured the angle of the shadow in Alexandria. He knew the distance between Alexandria and Syene, about 5,000 stadia, a unit of measurement used in the ancient world. Using geometry, he calculated that if the angle difference represented that distance, then the full circle of the Earth must be about 250,000 stadia. The exact accuracy depends on which stadium length he used, a detail lost to history. But by most estimates, he was remarkably close to the true figure, within a few percent. Using only careful observation and mathematics, a man in ancient Alexandria calculated the size of the planet. Eratosthenes also drew maps, attempting to chart the known world. He calculated the tilt of Earth's axis. He created a chronology of Greek history, trying to establish accurate dates for events that had been recorded in different city-states with different calendars. He embodied the library's spirit, curiosity combined with rigorous method, the belief that the universe could be understood through observation and reason. Hipparchus came later, in the 2nd century BCE. He was an astronomer, and he pushed the boundaries of what careful observation could achieve. He cataloged the positions of over 800 stars, creating perhaps the first comprehensive star map. He discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that means the night sky gradually changes over thousands of years. He developed trigonometry to help with astronomical calculations. He estimated the distance to the moon with impressive accuracy. All of this required patience, night after night of observation, meticulous record-keeping, comparison with earlier observations, some from Babylonian astronomers centuries before. The library gave him access to those earlier records, and he built upon them. Archimedes of Syracuse never lived in Alexandria, but he studied there in his youth and corresponded with scholars at the library throughout his life. They knew his work, preserved his writings, built on his ideas. Archimedes was perhaps the greatest mathematician and engineer of antiquity. He discovered principles of buoyancy and leverage. He calculated an approximation of pi. He found ways to calculate the areas and volumes of curved shapes. He invented machines, pulleys and screws, and defensive weapons. His mind ranged across pure mathematics and practical application. His connection to Alexandria shows how the library functioned as a network, a hub that connected thinkers across the Mediterranean world. Callimachus was a poet as well as a scholar. He created the Pinox, the great catalog of the library's holdings, but he also wrote hymns and epigrams, short poems that captured moments of beauty or wit in just a few lines. For him, scholarship and art weren't separate pursuits. They flowed together. He understood that knowledge needed organization to be useful, that a vast collection was worthless if no one could find anything. His cataloging work was tedious, perhaps, but essential. It transformed the library from a warehouse of scrolls into an accessible resource. And then there was Hypatia, who lived much later, around 400 CE, when the library's golden age had long since faded. By her time, the institution she worked in was probably the Serapeum, the daughter library, not the original Great Library, and Alexandria had changed dramatically. She was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher. She taught students who came from across the Mediterranean to learn from her. She wrote commentaries on the works of earlier mathematicians, helping to preserve and explain their ideas. In her time, Alexandria was increasingly divided by religious conflict. Christianity had become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, and tensions ran high between Christians, Jews, and those who still followed traditional Greek or Egyptian practices. Hypatia was caught in these conflicts. She represented the old Hellenistic intellectual tradition in an age when such things were becoming dangerous. In 415 CE, she was murdered by a mob, killed in the streets of Alexandria. Her death was a tragedy, but it also symbolized something larger, the end of an era, the closing of a world where pagan philosophers could teach freely, where knowledge from all traditions could be pursued without sectarian conflict. These scholars, Euclid, Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, Archimedes, Callimachus, Hypatia, and so many others whose names have been lost, shared certain qualities. They were curious. They asked questions about how the world worked, rather than simply accepting received wisdom. They were patient. Understanding came slowly, through careful observation and thought, through years or decades of work. They were collaborative. They built on each other's ideas, shared their findings, engaged in constructive debate. And they were sustained by the library, by its collections, by the community of inquiry it fostered, by the royal patronage that freed them to devote their lives to understanding. They represent what the library made possible. Not just the preservation of old knowledge, but the creation of new knowledge. The scrolls on the shelves were seeds, and the scholars were the gardeners who made them grow. To understand what was lost when the Library of Alexandria faded away, we need to understand what it contained. Not just in general terms, books, scrolls, knowledge, but in specific detail. What kinds of understanding did those shelves hold? Let's walk through the collection, subject by subject, imagining what a scholar might find. In the section devoted to mathematics, scrolls contained geometric proofs and number theory. There were Euclid's Elements, of course, but also earlier works that Euclid had drawn upon. Theorems attributed to Pythagoras and his followers, studies of proportion and ratio, explorations of prime numbers and perfect numbers. There were texts on practical mathematics too, how to calculate areas and volumes, how to divide inheritances fairly, how to determine the number of bricks needed for a building. Mathematics wasn't just abstract theory, it was a tool for solving real problems. Some scrolls contain Babylonian mathematics with its sophisticated algebra and its base 60 number system that we still use today when we divide the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds, the circle into 360 degrees. Astronomy occupied many shelves. The night sky had fascinated humans since the beginning of time, and Alexandria scholars had access to centuries of observations. There were star catalogs listing the positions and brightness of hundreds of celestial objects. There were records of lunar eclipses going back generations, allowing astronomers to detect patterns and make predictions. There were treatises on planetary motion, attempts to explain why planets sometimes appeared to move backward against the background of stars. The Babylonians had tracked the heavens with remarkable dedication, and their records made their way to Alexandria. The Egyptians, too, had their astronomical traditions, tied to their agricultural calendar and religious practices. Greek astronomers synthesized these traditions with their own observations, building increasingly sophisticated models of the cosmos. Some of these models were geocentric, placing Earth at the center with the heavens revolving around it. But there were also heliocentric ideas. Aristarchus of Samos, who worked in Alexandria, proposed that the Earth actually orbited the Sun. His idea didn't gain wide acceptance in antiquity, but it was preserved, discussed, considered. Centuries later, Copernicus would read about Aristarchus and cite him as a predecessor. Medicine and anatomy filled another section. The Egyptians had practiced medicine for thousands of years, and their knowledge was extensive: treatments for wounds, remedies for diseases, surgical procedures, anatomical observations. Alexandria became a center of medical research partly because Egyptian cultural attitudes toward the dead made certain practices possible. In most of the Greek world, dissecting human bodies was taboo. But in Alexandria, under certain circumstances and for a limited time, it was permitted. Herophilus and Erasistratus, two physicians who worked in Alexandria around 300 BCE, performed systematic dissections. They distinguished between arteries and veins. They traced nerves back to the brain and spinal cord. They studied the structure of the eye and the heart and the reproductive organs. They wrote detailed anatomical texts describing what they had observed, comparing human anatomy to that of animals. These texts resided in the library, available to future generations of physicians. There were also medical texts from other cultures: Babylonian remedies, Indian treatments, folk medicine from various regions. Some of it was effective based on observations of what actually helped patients. Some of it was superstition. The scholars attempted to sort through it all, testing and evaluating. Geography and cartography represented humanity's attempt to understand the shape and extent of the world. Maps were drawn on papyrus showing the Mediterranean and the lands beyond, the routes to India, the source of the Nile, the distant lands to the north and west where barbarian tribes lived. There were travelers' accounts, some reliable, some fanciful. Herodotus had traveled widely and recorded what he saw and what he was told. His histories were there, So were the accounts of Alexander's expedition to India, describing strange animals and plants, foreign customs, vast distances. Eratosthenes drew his map of the world using latitude and longitude, trying to place locations accurately according to astronomical observations. It was crude by modern standards, but it represented genuine progress in understanding Earth's geography. Philosophy occupied a place of honor. The works of Plato and Aristotle, of the pre-Socratic philosophers, of the Stoics and Epicureans, and skeptics. These weren't just abstract speculations, they were serious attempts to understand the nature of reality, the good life, the structure of the soul, the basis of ethics. There were debates about metaphysics. What is the fundamental nature of existence? Is the universe made of atoms, as Democritus claimed, or of earth, air, fire, and water, as others believed? Is there a divine intelligence that orders the cosmos, or does everything happen by chance? There were ethical treatises. How should one live? What makes a life good or virtuous? What do we owe to others? What is justice? These questions mattered deeply to the scholars of Alexandria. They weren't just academic puzzles. They were guides for how to understand oneself and one's place in the world. Literature and poetry filled many shelves. The complete works of the great Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, hundreds of plays, most of which would eventually be lost, leaving us with only a small fraction of their output. The comedies of Aristophanes and others, satirizing Athenian politics and society. Epic poetry, including not just Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but countless other epics that chronicled heroic deeds and mythological tales. Lyric poetry, Sappho's verses about love and desire, Pindar's ode celebrating athletic victors. Different editions existed with variant readings, and scholars compared them, trying to establish accurate texts. There was also new poetry being created in Alexandria itself. Callimachus and Apollonius of Rhodes and Theocritus wrote in new styles, experimenting with form and language, conscious that they were contributing to a living literary tradition. History and biography attempted to preserve the memory of the past. Herodotus and Thucydides describing the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. Xenophon's accounts of Spartan society and Persian culture. Local histories of various Greek city-states. Chronicles of Egyptian pharaohs going back thousands of years. There were also technical manuals, engineering texts describing how to build siege engines or water clocks or theatrical machines. Agricultural texts explaining when to plant and harvest, how to graft trees, how to breed livestock. Architectural texts with plans and proportions for temples and theaters. Legal documents too, the laws of Athens, of Sparta, of other city-states. Comparisons of different legal systems. Philosophical treatises on the nature of law and justice. And there were texts we can barely imagine because they came from traditions so foreign to what survived. Works from ancient Persia, Phoenician histories, perhaps texts from Carthage, from India, from distant lands whose contributions to human knowledge were real but have been entirely erased. The scope was breathtaking. This wasn't just Greek knowledge, it was human knowledge from as many sources as the Ptolemies could gather. And yet, even at its height, the library was incomplete. The world was larger than anyone in Alexandria realized. There were entire civilizations in China, in the Americas, in sub-Saharan Africa, whose knowledge would never find its way to those shelves. Still, within the bounds of what the ancient Mediterranean world could access, the Library of Alexandria came closer than any other institution to capturing the full range of human understanding. For a few centuries, it held within its walls a remarkable portion of what humanity had learned about itself and the universe. And then, slowly, that knowledge began to slip away. Before we explore how the library was truly lost, we need to clear away some of the myths that have grown up around it. The story of the Library of Alexandria has been told and retold so many times that fiction and fact have become tangled together. Let's gently separate them. The first misconception is about the library itself. The idea that it was a single monumental building, like a modern library with its grand reading room and towering stacks. The reality was more complex. The library was part of the Mouse-Ion, which was itself a complex of buildings in the royal quarter of Alexandria. There were reading halls, certainly, but also lecture rooms, gardens, dining areas, living quarters for scholars. It was more like a university campus than a single structure. And there wasn't just one library in Alexandria. The main collection was part of the Mouse-Ion, but there was also a daughter library, the Serapeum, housed in the Temple of Serapis. This was a substantial collection in its own right, serving a different part of the city. Some scholars believe there may have been other smaller libraries as well, collections in various temples and institutions throughout Alexandria. When ancient writers refer to the Library of Alexandria, they might be talking about any or all of these. This matters because it affects how we understand what was lost. If there were multiple libraries, then a fire in one location wouldn't necessarily destroy everything. The second misconception is about how the library ended. The popular image of a single catastrophic fire that destroyed everything in one terrible night. This is the story that captures the imagination. A conflagration sweeping through the halls, flames consuming centuries of knowledge, scrolls turning to ash, the accumulated wisdom of humanity going up in smoke. It's dramatic. It's tragic. It provides a clear moment of loss, a specific event to mourn. But it's not what happened. The library didn't die in a single moment. It faded over centuries through a combination of neglect, political instability, and cultural transformation. There were fires, yes, but fires were common in the ancient world. Buildings burned, collections were damaged, and then they were rebuilt, or partially rebuilt, or not rebuilt at all depending on circumstances. The third misconception involves blame, the urge to find a villain, someone responsible for destroying the library. Over the centuries, different groups have been accused. Julius Caesar and his Roman legions, Christian mobs in the 4th century, Muslim conquerors in the 7th century. Each telling of the story tends to cast whoever the teller disapproves of as the destroyer of knowledge. But history resists such simple narratives. The library's decline had many causes and many players. It wasn't murdered by a single villain. It died of 1,000 small failures, a slow accumulation of neglect and misfortune. This doesn't mean no one bears responsibility. Political leaders who cut funding, religious zealots who attacked pagan institutions, military commanders who allowed cultural sites to be damaged all played roles. But it wasn't a conspiracy or a single act of destruction. It was the ordinary tragedy of institutions that aren't valued enough to be maintained. The fourth misconception is about what exactly was lost. Sometimes you hear claims that the library contained revolutionary knowledge, cures for diseases, solutions to mathematical problems that wouldn't be rediscovered for 1,000 years, technological marvels. Some of this is probably true. We know ancient mathematicians made discoveries that were later forgotten. We know medical texts were lost. We know engineering knowledge disappeared. But we should be careful not to romanticize too much. The library contained the accumulated knowledge of its time, which was considerable but also limited. Ancient scholars were brilliant, but they didn't have electron microscopes or particle accelerators. They couldn't sequence DNA or measure the speed of light precisely. What was lost was real and significant, but we shouldn't imagine it contained solutions to modern problems or knowledge that would seem magical to us. It contained human insights, hard-won through observation and reason, preserved in the best way the ancient world knew how. The final misconception is the idea that the loss was complete and total, that nothing survived. In fact, much did survive, though often in roundabout ways. Greek and Roman scholars copied texts before the library declined. Byzantine scribes preserved works through the Middle Ages. Arab scholars translated and transmitted knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The Renaissance rediscovered texts that had been preserved in monasteries. What we lost wasn't everything, it was a percentage, impossible to calculate precisely. Maybe half of what the library contained, maybe more. Enough that we notice the gaps, that we mourn what's missing, but not so much that we live in complete ignorance of the ancient world. These misconceptions matter because they shape how we think about the library's loss. If we imagine a single catastrophic fire, we miss the real lesson. That knowledge is fragile not because it can be destroyed in an instant, but because it requires constant care to preserve. If we imagine a villain, we miss the more important truth. That knowledge is usually lost through ordinary neglect, through budget cuts and shifting priorities, through the gradual erosion of institutions. If we romanticize what was lost too much, we miss the real tragedy, that what disappeared were human voices, genuine insights, hard-won understanding that can never be recovered. The true story of the Library of Alexandria is not a simple tale of glory and destruction. It's a complex story of ambition and achievement, of gradual decline and partial preservation, of knowledge lost and knowledge saved. It's time now to explore that decline, to understand how the Library of Alexandria truly disappeared. Imagine a scroll sitting on a shelf in the Library of Alexandria. It contains a philosophical treatise, a work by an author whose name you've never heard because none of his writings survived. The scroll is old. The papyrus has become brittle with age and handling. The ink has faded in places, making some passages difficult to read. But the text is still there, still accessible, if someone takes the care to unroll it carefully. For this scroll to survive another generation, something has to happen. Someone has to decide it's worth copying. A scribe has to be assigned the task, given fresh papyrus and ink, given the time to sit and transcribe the text word by word. If that happens, the knowledge continues. The old scroll can finally crumble to dust, but the new copy preserves what it contained. But if no one makes that decision, if the text is deemed unimportant, or if there's no budget for copying, or if the scribe who knows how to read this particular dialect has died, then the scroll sits on its shelf, growing more fragile with each passing year. Eventually, the papyrus becomes too delicate to unroll. The text is still there, technically, but it's no longer accessible. And then, in time, the scroll simply falls apart. The knowledge vanishes. This is how libraries truly disappear, not in flames, but in silence. One text at a time, one decision not to copy, one budget cut, one shift in priorities. The Library of Alexandria declined slowly over centuries, and the causes were as varied as they were mundane. Political instability played a major role. The Ptolemaic dynasty that had founded and supported the library began to weaken. Royal succession became contested. Different claimants fought for the throne. Egypt became a pawn in the power struggles of the wider Mediterranean world. When Rome began to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, Egypt lost its independence. The Ptolemies became client rulers, dependent on Roman support. Resources that once flowed to the library and the Mouseion were diverted to other purposes, to paying tribute to Rome, to funding armies, to maintaining a lavish court. Royal patronage, which had been the library's lifeblood, began to dry up. Stipends for scholars were reduced. Funds for acquiring new texts diminished. The budget for copying and maintaining the existing collection shrank. The library didn't close suddenly. It simply became less vibrant, less well-funded, less of a priority. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey in Rome's civil war. He became entangled in Egypt's own succession dispute, supporting Cleopatra against her brother. Fighting broke out in the city. Caesar's forces set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbor to prevent it from being used against him. The fire spread to warehouses along the docks. Ancient sources mention that books were destroyed in this fire. Perhaps scrolls stored in warehouses awaiting shipment, or perhaps part of a library collection near the harbor. The extent of the damage is debated by historians. Some ancient writers claim the entire library burned. Others suggest the damage was limited. Most modern scholars believe the main library in the Mouseion survived, though some portion of Alexandria's book collection was certainly lost. But here's what matters. Even if the damage was significant, it wasn't necessarily fatal. Libraries can be rebuilt if there's will and resources to do so. Text can be acquired again, copied from other collections, reconstructed from memory. What couldn't be rebuilt as easily was the institutional support, the culture of scholarship, the sense that the library was a vital part of Alexandria's identity. After Caesar, after Cleopatra's suicide and Egypt's absorption into the Roman Empire, Alexandria remained an important city. It was still a center of learning. Scholars still worked there, but the Golden Age had passed. The Roman Empire brought a different set of priorities. Rome valued practical knowledge, engineering, law, military strategy. Greek philosophy and poetry still mattered, but more as cultural adornments than as living traditions of inquiry. Copying continued, but more selectively. Popular texts were preserved. Homer, Euclid, the major philosophers. But obscure works, specialized treatises, texts in languages other than Greek and Latin, these were less likely to be deemed worth the expense of copying. And so the collection began to shrink, not through destruction, but through triage. Each generation preserved what it thought important and let the rest fade away. Cultural and religious transformations accelerated the decline. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and eventually became the official religion in the 4th century CE, attitudes toward pagan learning grew complicated. Some Christian scholars valued the Greek philosophical tradition, seeing it as compatible with Christian theology. They preserved and studied Plato and Aristotle, incorporating their ideas into Christian thought. But others viewed pagan literature with suspicion or hostility. Texts that dealt with polytheistic religion, with practices condemned by Christianity, with philosophies that competed with Christian doctrine, these became dangerous to own or study. It's important to be nuanced here. Christians didn't simply destroy pagan learning. Many of the texts we have from antiquity survive, because Christian monks copied them in medieval monasteries. The relationship between Christianity and classical knowledge was complex, involving both preservation and suppression. But in Alexandria specifically, tensions ran high. The city had a large Christian population by the 4th century, but also significant communities of Jews and pagans. Riots and violence erupted over religious differences. In 391 CE, the Serapeum, the daughter library in the Temple of Serapis, was destroyed by a Christian mob. The temple had been a center of pagan worship, and its destruction was part of a broader campaign against pagan institutions. How many books were in the Serapeum at that time? We don't know. Some historians believe the collection had already been moved or dispersed. Others think significant holdings were lost. The ancient sources are vague and contradictory. What's certain is that by the late 4th century, the old Hellenistic institutions of Alexandria were under pressure. The Mouseion, if it still existed as a functioning institution, was a shadow of its former self. Hypatia's murder in 415 CE symbolized the end of an era. She represented the last flowering of Alexandria's classical philosophical tradition. After her death, the city's reputation as a center of pagan learning was finished. But even after this, scholarship continued in Alexandria. There were Christian schools, medical schools, philosophical schools operating in a Christian framework. Knowledge didn't disappear entirely. It transformed, adapted to new cultural contexts. The final blow came in the 7th century with the Arab conquest of Egypt. According to a famous story recorded centuries later, the conqueror asked the caliph what to do with the books of Alexandria. The caliph supposedly replied that if the books agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were harmful. Either way, they should be burned. This story is almost certainly apocryphal, written long after the events by an author with political motivations. Most historians don't believe it happened. What actually happened was more prosaic. The Arab conquest brought new rulers and a new language, Arabic. Institutional continuity was disrupted. Buildings fell into disuse or were repurposed. Collections were dispersed. But the Arab conquerors were not hostile to learning. Within a few generations, they would establish their own great libraries and centers of scholarship. They would translate Greek texts into Arabic, preserving works that might otherwise have been lost. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad would echo the ambitions of Alexandria's library. The true end of the Library of Alexandria wasn't any of these dramatic moments. It was the slow accumulation of all of them: fire, neglect, religious conflict, cultural transformation, conquest, the ordinary decay of papyrus, the decisions not to copy texts that no longer seem relevant. It was scholars dying without passing on their knowledge. It was languages falling out of use, making texts unreadable. It was institutional funding being cut, making professional copying impossible. It was priorities shifting so that resources went elsewhere. It was, in the end, the simple fact that maintaining a library requires constant effort and resources, and when those fail, knowledge slips away like sand through fingers. No one decided to destroy all the knowledge of Alexandria. It happened anyway, through the cumulative effect of many small failures across many generations. This is how libraries truly disappear. Even though we just explored the complex reality of the library's decline, it's worth looking more closely at the specific stories that have become famous, the moments people point to when they ask, when was the Library of Alexandria destroyed? These stories persist because humans like narratives with clear beginnings and endings. We want to know when something happened, who was responsible, what the moment looked like. The messy truth of gradual decline doesn't satisfy the way a dramatic story does. So let's examine these stories, not to assign blame, but to understand what probably happened and why these accounts became so powerful in our collective memory. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE is the earliest of the famous destruction stories. As we mentioned, Caesar was in Alexandria during Egypt's civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. He held a small section of the city with his forces, surrounded by hostile Egyptians. To prevent the Egyptian fleet from being used against him, he ordered his men to set it ablaze. The fire spread. Ancient Alexandria was a city of stone and marble, yes, but also of wood and papyrus and fabric. Warehouses lined the harbor. The fire consumed them. Several ancient writers mention books being destroyed in this fire. Seneca, writing about a century later, claimed that 40,000 books burned. Plutarch mentions the fire spreading to the Great Library. Dio Cassius says book repositories were destroyed. But other sources are silent about library damage. And some historians note that the main library, in the royal quarter near the palace, was some distance from the harbor where the fire started. What probably happened is this: some books were destroyed, possibly a significant number. These might have been scrolls stored in harbor warehouses, perhaps waiting to be shipped elsewhere, or perhaps a secondary collection. The main library in the Mount Sion likely survived, though it may have suffered some damage. The event was traumatic for Alexandria, certainly, but it wasn't the end of the library. Scholars continued working there for centuries afterward. The institution limped on. The second major story involves the rise of Christianity and the destruction of pagan temples in the late 4th century. We've touched on this already. The Serapeum, destroyed in 391 CE by a Christian mob with the support or at least acquiescence of the religious authorities. The context matters here. The Emperor Theodosius had made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan temples were being closed or converted throughout the empire. In Alexandria, tensions between Christians and pagans had been building for years. The Serapeum was not just a library, it was a temple to Serapis, a syncretic deity combining Greek and Egyptian attributes. For Christians, it represented idolatry, false worship that needed to be eliminated. The temple was attacked, its statues destroyed, its structure damaged or demolished. The fate of its book collection is unclear. Some ancient sources mention books being destroyed. Others don't mention books at all. By 391 CE, for centuries after the library's founding, how much of the original collection still existed? How much was still in the Serapeum specifically versus other locations? We simply don't know. What we do know is that Christian mobs in this period did sometimes destroy books, particularly those dealing with magic, astrology, or pagan religious practices. The Acts of the Apostles describes early Christians burning books of magic in Ephesus. Similar burnings occurred elsewhere, but we also know that Christian scholars preserved many classical texts. The very sources we have about ancient Alexandria come to us through Christian copyists. Monks in medieval monasteries, Christian scholars in Byzantium. They kept classical learning alive, even as they rejected its religious content. The reality is nuanced. Some Christians destroyed pagan books. Other Christians preserved them. The Serapeum's destruction was part of a larger pattern of religious conflict, not a unique act of anti-intellectual vandalism. The third famous story is the one we mentioned earlier, the Arab conquest of Egypt in 640 to 642 CE, and the supposed order to burn the library's books. This story first appears in writing about 550 years after the conquest, in a text by a Christian writer describing the deeds of the Muslim general. The story goes that the books of Alexandria were distributed to the city's bathhouses and used as fuel for their furnaces, and that it took 6 months to burn them all. Most historians consider this story fictional, created long after the fact to cast the Muslim conquerors in a negative light during a period of Crusader Muslim conflict. There are several problems with the story. First, by 640 CE, there probably wasn't much left of the ancient library to destroy. Second, the early Muslim conquerors were generally respectful of libraries and scholarship. Within a few generations, they would create their own great centers of learning. Third, no contemporary sources mention this event, which would have been remarkable enough to record if it had happened. The story tells us more about medieval Christian-Muslim relations than about what actually happened in the 7th century. So what really happened during the Arab conquest? Egypt changed hands from Byzantine Christian rule to Muslim Arab rule. This was a significant political and cultural transformation. Institutions tied to the old regime lost support. The Greek language, while still used, became less dominant as Arabic spread. Buildings fell into disuse, but there was no systematic destruction of knowledge. If anything, the opposite occurred over time. Arab scholars actively sought out Greek texts, translated them into Arabic, and built upon them. Much of what we know about Greek mathematics, medicine, and philosophy comes to us through Arabic translations and commentaries. These three stories, Caesar's fire, the Serapeum's destruction, the Arab conquest, have become the famous moments in the library's end. But focusing on them obscures more than it reveals. The real story is less dramatic. A great institution slowly losing relevance and support over centuries. Fires damaged parts of the collection at various times. Religious conflicts led to the destruction of some texts and the neglect of others. Conquest disrupted institutional continuity. But most of all, the library faded because maintaining such an institution requires sustained commitment and resources, and that commitment eventually failed. There's a reason these dramatic stories persist, though. They provide catharsis. They let us imagine a moment when something precious was lost, someone to blame, a clear before and after. The reality that the library died of 1,000 small cuts, of ordinary human failures, of changing priorities and limited resources is harder to grasp emotionally. It doesn't give us a villain to hate or a specific tragedy to mourn, but it's also more important to understand because the forces that destroyed the Library of Alexandria are still at work today. Institutions still lose funding. Priorities still shift. Knowledge still slips away when we stop paying attention. The library's true destruction wasn't an event. It was a process, and understanding that process helps us recognize when it's happening around us now. Now we come to the most haunting question. What exactly disappeared when the Library of Alexandria faded away? This is where speculation meets loss, where we confront the limits of what we can know about what we don't know. It's like trying to describe the shape of a whole, the weight of an absence. But we can make educated guesses based on fragments, on references in surviving texts to works that no longer exist, on patterns in what did survive versus what didn't. Let's start with numbers, though they can only tell us so much. Ancient sources claim the library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Estimates vary wildly. Some say 400,000, others claim 700,000. These numbers might include duplicates, multiple copies of the same work, different editions. A single book in the modern sense might occupy multiple scrolls, each counted separately. Even being conservative, the library probably contained works by thousands of different authors. We know this because surviving ancient bibliographies and catalogs reference authors and titles that have completely vanished. Of ancient Greek literature, the core of the collection, scholars estimate that we possess perhaps 10% of what once existed. Probably less. Think about what that means. Imagine 9/10 of all the books you've ever encountered simply not existing. 9 out of every 10 authors you've ever heard of having no surviving works at all. 9/10 of human creative and intellectual output from an entire civilization gone. In drama, the loss is staggering. The Athenians wrote and performed hundreds of tragedies and comedies over several centuries. We have complete texts for 7 tragedies by Aeschylus out of the 70 or more he wrote. 7 plays by Sophocles out of more than 120. 19 by Euripides out of 92. For comedy, we have 11 plays by Aristophanes and fragments of many others. But there were dozens of comic playwrights whose works are completely lost. These weren't minor works. In their own time, they were performed at major festivals, won competitions, moved audiences to tears or laughter. And now they're gone, leaving only their titles and occasionally a few quoted lines in other texts. What themes did they explore? What insights into human nature did they contain? What poetry, what clever wordplay, what memorable characters? We'll never know. In history, we've lost most of the detailed accounts that ancient historians compiled. Livy wrote 142 books on Roman history. We have 35. Everything about Rome's early monarchy and much of its Republican period comes to us through these surviving fragments and summaries made by later writers. Greek historical writing is even more fragmentary. We have Herodotus and Thucydides, but dozens of other historians are lost. Their perspectives, their sources, their analyses vanished. In philosophy, we know the names of many pre-Socratic thinkers: Heraclitus, Parmenides, Democritus, and dozens more, but we have only fragments of their original writings, sometimes just a few sentences quoted by later authors. What philosophies existed that we don't even know about? What arguments, what ideas, what ways of understanding the world? They disappeared without leaving even a trace in surviving texts. In science and mathematics, the loss is particularly poignant because we can see hints of knowledge that was later rediscovered only after centuries. The ancient Greeks developed sophisticated models of planetary motion. Some of these models were wrong by modern standards, but some were remarkably accurate. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model, the Earth orbiting the Sun, in the 3rd century BCE. His work didn't survive in full. We know about it only because other writers mentioned it. How detailed was his model? What evidence did he present? What calculations did he perform? We don't know. When Copernicus proposed his heliocentric model in the 16th century, he had to start from scratch, though he didn't know that Aristarchus had preceded him. In mathematics, we know that ancient mathematicians worked on problems that wouldn't be solved again until much later. They studied conic sections, developed approximations of irrational numbers, explored the properties of prime numbers. How much of their work was lost? In engineering, the ancients built remarkable machines: automated theaters, water organs, steam-powered toys, astronomical computers like the Antikythera mechanism discovered in a shipwreck. We know these things existed because we have the artifacts or descriptions, but the detailed treatises explaining how to build them, the theoretical understanding behind them, mostly lost. Library of Alexandria wrote about automata and mechanical devices. Some of his work survives, but in fragmentary form, copied and recopied with errors and omissions. How much more did he know that wasn't written down, or was written down and didn't survive? In medicine, ancient physicians accumulated centuries of clinical observations. They documented symptoms, treatments, outcomes. They performed surgeries, set broken bones, treated diseases. Their medical texts contained this practical knowledge. We have some medical writings from antiquity, Hippocrates, Galen, others, but we've lost most of it. How many effective treatments were forgotten? How many insights into human anatomy and physiology? How much would medical knowledge have progressed if this continuity hadn't been broken? Geography and ethnography represent another profound loss. Ancient travelers visited distant lands and wrote accounts of what they saw. Most of these accounts are gone. We've lost descriptions of cultures that no longer exist, of landscapes before they were transformed by human activity, of animals that are now extinct. We've lost the observations of people who saw the world with fresh eyes, who encountered the unfamiliar and tried to understand and record it. In poetry and literature, we've lost voices, literally. The voices of individuals who captured their experiences, emotions, and insights in words. We have fragments of Sappho's poetry, enough to know she was brilliant. But most of her work is gone. How many other poets of comparable genius are completely lost? The library contained texts in languages that are now dead or barely understood. What did those texts say? What perspectives from cultures that left few traces in history? What wisdom from traditions that didn't survive antiquity? Perhaps most haunting is what we don't even know we're missing. The unknown unknowns. The authors whose names don't survive even in references. The ideas that didn't leave any trace in later thought. The discoveries that were made and then completely forgotten. There might have been a philosopher who solved problems we still wrestle with. There might have been a mathematician who made breakthroughs we haven't achieved. There might have been a poet whose works would be considered the greatest in any language, if only they had survived. We'll never know. The loss isn't just about the texts themselves. It's about the conversations they enabled, the debates they sparked, the ideas they inspired. Knowledge builds on knowledge. When you lose the foundation, you lose everything that would have been built upon it. What would our world look like if that knowledge had survived? Would scientific progress have been faster? Would we understand our history better? Would we have a richer literary and philosophical tradition? Perhaps. Or perhaps those texts would have moldered unread on shelves, their insights unappreciated. Knowledge is only valuable if minds engage with it. But the fact remains, an enormous portion of humanity's intellectual and creative heritage from the ancient world simply doesn't exist anymore. The Library of Alexandria, which brought so much of that knowledge together in one place, failed in its fundamental mission to preserve it for future generations. And we are those future generations living with that loss, trying to imagine what we've missed, feeling the weight of an absence we can never fully measure. But loss is not the end of the story. Because even though the Library of Alexandria is gone, its influence echoes through time. The dream that inspired it, the dream of collecting and preserving all human knowledge, has never died. Walk into any great library today, and you're walking in Alexandria's shadow. The British Library in London, with its millions of books and manuscripts. The Library of Congress in Washington, holding the largest collection in the world. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. These institutions trace their lineage, at least in spirit, back to that ancient vision of a universal repository of knowledge. They exist because people in later centuries looked back at what was lost and decided it must never happen again. The story of Alexandria's library became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when knowledge isn't valued and protected. Medieval monasteries preserved classical texts through centuries of political chaos and economic collapse in Europe. Monks spent their lives copying manuscripts by hand, often texts they didn't fully understand, written in a culture very different from their own. They did this partly for religious reasons. Some classical texts had been incorporated into Christian theology, but they also did it because they recognized these works as precious, as part of human heritage worth saving. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the 9th century, deliberately echoed Alexandria's ambitions. The Abbasid caliphs gathered scholars, collected texts, sponsored translations from Greek to Arabic, from Sanskrit to Arabic, from Persian to Arabic. They built upon what had been preserved, adding new knowledge, creating new syntheses. They exist because people in later centuries looked back at what was lost and decided it must never happen again. When European scholars in the Renaissance rediscovered classical learning, much of what they found came through these Arabic translations and commentaries. Knowledge that had been lost in Europe had survived in the Islamic world. The Renaissance itself was partly about recovering what had been lost. Scholars scoured monasteries for old manuscripts. They learned Greek to read classical texts in the original. They established the first printed editions of ancient works, making them available to wider audiences than ever before. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, changed everything. Suddenly, copying a text didn't require months of a scribe's labor. Books could be produced in hundreds of copies, distributed widely, preserved in multiple locations. The vulnerability that doomed Alexandria, that knowledge existed in single copies or small numbers of copies, became less acute. And yet, the digital age has brought new echoes of Alexandria's dream and new versions of its vulnerabilities. The internet is, in a sense, the closest we've come to realizing Alexandria's vision. All human knowledge, accessible to anyone with a connection. Wikipedia alone contains millions of articles in hundreds of languages. Digital libraries provide access to texts that once required traveling to specific physical locations to consult. But the internet is also fragile in ways that echo Alexandria's fate. Websites disappear. Digital storage media decay. File formats become obsolete. Companies that host vast amounts of data go out of business. Without constant maintenance, digital information can vanish as completely as ancient papyrus. There's a term in digital preservation, bit rot, the gradual corruption of data over time. It's not so different from the physical decay of scrolls in ancient Alexandria. The Internet Archive, a nonprofit organization, works to preserve websites and digital content, taking regular snapshots of the internet so that future researchers can see what existed at different moments in time. It's essentially doing what the Library of Alexandria tried to do, preserving knowledge not just for today, but for future generations. In 2002, the Egyptian government, in partnership with UNESCO and other international organizations, opened the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a modern library built near the site of the ancient one. It's a beautiful building, a striking piece of contemporary architecture. Its collection contains hundreds of thousands of books. It hosts conferences, exhibitions, cultural events. It houses digital archives and special collections. It can't replace what was lost. Nothing can. But it represents a conscious decision to honor the legacy of the ancient library, to reassert Alexandria's historical role as a center of learning and to contribute to the global effort to preserve and share knowledge. The spirit of the Library of Alexandria lives on in other ways too. In the open access movement, which argues that scholarly knowledge should be freely available rather than locked behind paywalls. In efforts to digitize rare manuscripts and make them accessible online. In translation projects that bring works from one language and culture into others. Every time someone decides that knowledge is worth preserving, worth sharing, worth making accessible, they're honoring what the Library of Alexandria represented. And every time we fail to preserve something, when archives are neglected, when digital data is lost, when languages die taking their literature with them, when books are pulped or recordings are erased, we repeat Alexandria's tragedy. The lesson of Alexandria isn't just about what we lost. It's about the ongoing responsibility we have to preserve and transmit knowledge. It's about recognizing that this preservation doesn't happen automatically. It requires resources, attention, care, and a collective commitment to valuing knowledge for its own sake. The Library of Alexandria ultimately failed in its mission, but the mission itself remains as urgent today as it was 2,000 years ago. Perhaps more so, because we now produce more information in a day than existed in all of ancient Alexandria, and most of it is stored in formats that may not be readable in a few decades. We are, in a sense, still trying to build the Library of Alexandria. We're still trying to gather all human knowledge, to preserve it, to make it accessible to anyone who seeks it. And we're still grappling with the same challenges: limited resources, competing priorities, the tension between preservation and access, the difficulty of deciding what's worth keeping. The ancient library is gone, but its dream persists, calling to us across the centuries, reminding us of what's at stake when we fail to protect the accumulated wisdom of our species. As we near the end of our journey through the story of the Library of Alexandria, let's step back and reflect on what it all means, not with urgency or alarm, but with the quiet acceptance that comes from understanding the nature of things. Knowledge is a strange phenomenon. Unlike physical objects, it doesn't exist in any one place. A book can burn, but if the knowledge it contains lives in 100 other books, or in the minds of scholars who've read it, then nothing essential is lost. But knowledge is also fragile in ways physical objects aren't. A stone tablet can sit in the desert for thousands of years, still readable. But knowledge requires a chain of transmission. Someone must read it, understand it, teach it to others, copy it for the next generation. Break that chain, and the knowledge vanishes even if the physical text remains. The Library of Alexandria attempted to create a reservoir of knowledge, a place where the chain of transmission could be maintained indefinitely. It succeeded for a few centuries. Then it failed, and much of what it held disappeared. This can feel like a tragedy, and it is, but it's also worth considering a different perspective. Everything in the universe tends toward disorder. This is a fundamental law of physics. Entropy increases. Stars burn out. Mountains erode. Organisms die. Order gives way to chaos. In this context, the existence of knowledge at all is remarkable. For a brief moment in cosmic time, Matter organized itself into living beings capable of observing the universe, thinking about it, recording their thoughts, and transmitting them across generations. The Library of Alexandria was an expression of that improbable order. Human minds, working together, gathered and preserved insights. For a few centuries, the light of understanding burned brightly in those halls. That the light eventually dimmed is sad, yes, but perhaps no more sad than the fact that every individual who contributed to that knowledge also died, their consciousness extinguished, their unique perspective on the world lost. We are all temporary. Our works are temporary. Civilizations are temporary. Even the stars are temporary on a long enough timeline. And yet we create. We learn. We build. We preserve what we can for as long as we can. Not because we can make anything permanent, but because the effort itself has meaning. The scholars of Alexandria knew they were mortal. They knew papyrus decayed. They knew political fortunes could change. And still they worked, copying texts by lamplight, making careful observations of the stars, debating the nature of reality. They worked not with a guarantee of permanence, but with hope. Hope that their efforts would matter, that the knowledge they preserved would be useful to someone, sometime, even if they could never know who or when. Much of what they preserved was lost, but not all of it. And what survives has shaped human civilization in countless ways. Euclid's Elements remained a foundational text for 2 millennia. The medical knowledge preserved from Alexandria influenced physicians for generations. The philosophical ideas debated in those halls still inform how we think today. Even the knowledge that was lost completely served a purpose while it existed. It taught students. It inspired new ideas. It connected one generation to another. The fact that it eventually disappeared doesn't negate the meaning it had while it lasted. There's a Buddhist concept relevant here, impermanence and nikka in Pali. The recognition that all conditioned things are temporary. This isn't a cause for despair, but for appreciation. Precisely because things don't last, each moment has value. Precisely because knowledge is fragile, the effort to preserve and share it matters. If knowledge were indestructible, if once something was learned it could never be forgotten, then perhaps we wouldn't value it as much. The fragility creates responsibility. The possibility of loss creates urgency, not panicked urgency, but the gentle urgency of knowing that what we have now won't necessarily be here tomorrow unless we care for it. The Library of Alexandria teaches us that knowledge is a garden, not a monument. It requires tending. It must be cultivated. When we neglect it, weeds grow and the garden returns to wilderness. But unlike a physical garden, knowledge gardens can regenerate in unexpected ways. An idea lost in one culture can emerge independently in another. A question asked in ancient Alexandria might be asked again centuries later, leading to new insights. Knowledge has a strange persistence. It wants to be discovered, to be thought, to be known. What was lost from Alexandria wasn't destroyed. It simply returned to the realm of potential, waiting to be discovered again. Some of it has been. Some of it will be. Some of it may remain forever in that realm, never to be actualized again. And that's all right. That's the nature of existence in a universe of change and impermanence. We do what we can. We preserve what we can. We learn what we can, and we accept that our efforts, however sincere, will always be incomplete. The scholars of ancient Alexandria have been dead for centuries. The scrolls they studied have crumbled to dust. The buildings where they worked are gone. And yet here we are, still talking about them, still inspired by their vision, still trying to realize the dream they pursued. In that sense, they succeeded. Not in creating something permanent, nothing is permanent, but in creating something that mattered enough that people continue to care about it, to learn from it, to be moved by it 2,000 years later. That's what knowledge does when it's truly valuable. It echoes through time, touching minds across the centuries, creating continuity even in the midst of constant change. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but the spirit that built it, the curiosity, the reverence for learning, the belief that understanding matters, that spirit is immortal because it lives whenever and wherever humans decide to pursue knowledge and preserve it for those who come after. And so we come to the end of our journey through the story of the Library of Alexandria. We began in the harbor at twilight, watching ships arrive with their cargo of scrolls. We walked through the reading halls where scholars worked by lamplight. We met the people who built the library, who filled it with knowledge, who studied there and created new understanding. We explored what the library contained: mathematics and medicine, poetry and philosophy, geography and astronomy, the accumulated wisdom of cultures from across the ancient world. And we watched slowly and gently as that great institution faded away. Not in a single catastrophic fire, but through the ordinary processes of decline, budget cuts and political instability, religious transformation and cultural change, the simple failure to keep copying texts that no longer seemed important. We considered what was lost, the plays and histories, the scientific treatises and philosophical works, the voices of individuals who thought and felt and created, now silent forever. And we recognize the echoes of Alexandria in our own world, in every library that preserves knowledge, in every effort to make information accessible, in every decision to value learning for its own sake. The story of the Library of Alexandria is ultimately a human story. It's about our capacity to create something greater than ourselves, to build institutions that outlast any individual life. And it's about our limitations, our inability to make anything truly permanent, our tendency to lose sight of what matters when other pressures intrude. But it's also about continuity. The scholars of Alexandria have been gone for centuries, but their questions are still our questions. How does the universe work? What makes a life good? How can we understand ourselves and our world? The pursuit of these questions continues unbroken across all the changes and losses of history. Knowledge is like water in this way. You can dam it, channel it, try to contain it, but it always finds a way to flow. What was lost from Alexandria has, in some cases, been rediscovered. What wasn't rediscovered may not have needed to be. New insights replace old ones. New voices speak truths the old voices never imagined. The library's loss reminds us to be careful, to value what we have, to preserve what matters. But it also reminds us not to despair. Human curiosity is resilient. The desire to understand, to learn, to preserve, it survives every catastrophe, every dark age, every period of chaos and loss. As long as there are minds that wonder, there will be something like Alexandria. Maybe not in a single building by the Mediterranean Sea, but in the collective effort of all who seek knowledge and try to pass it on. So rest easy knowing that the work continues, that libraries still stand, still gather and preserve, that scholars still study, still debate, still push at the boundaries of understanding, that the dream that inspired Alexandria, the dream of universal knowledge accessible to all, is still being pursued in new forms with new tools, but with the same essential spirit. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but what it represented endures. And that's enough. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history and memory, through achievement and loss, through the quiet halls where knowledge once rested and still rests, in different forms, in different places, waiting for curious minds to discover it. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Sleepy Legends. There are more stories to tell, of legendary places and remarkable people, of myths that shaped civilizations and creatures that captured human imagination, each told gently, at a pace meant for contemplation, for that quiet time before sleep when the mind wanders through history and dream. Leave a comment if there's a particular legend or place you'd like to hear about. Your suggestions guide future journeys. For now, though, let this story settle. Let the image of those lamplight halls fade into whatever dreams may come. The Library of Alexandria is there in the past, waiting to be remembered. And you've remembered it, honored it by listening. That's all any of us can do. Remember, honor, and carry forward what matters. Good night.